Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku was cursed with immortality. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was ending in shades of gray and crimson. Dust, thick as funeral shrouds, choked the air in the ruins of what was once Kamino Ward's gleaming city center. It swirled in lazy eddies around the skeletal remains of skyscrapers, their glass and steel bones twisted into agonizing shapes. The reek of ozone, superheated metal, and something acridly sweet, the scent of blood atomized by overwhelming power, clung to everything. It was a battlefield that had long since forgotten the meaning of surrender. Izuku Midoriya, known to the world as Deku, the ninth holder of One for All, felt the end coiling in his bones. Not the end of the world, but the end of this fight, one way or another. His suit, the state-of-the-art costume Gamma, was a tattered ruin. The armored plates were cracked and rent, the green fabric shredded to ribbons that fluttered around him like prayer flags in a desecrated temple. Every muscle fiber screamed. His left arm, twice shattered and twice reset in the field by a medic's desperate quirk, was a numb, heavy thing. Black-whipped tendrils, flickering and unstable, coiled weakly around his forearms, the energy reserves of the past holders within him strained to their absolute limit. Across the cratered plaza stood their tormentor. The man called himself Kronos. He wasn't a creature of raw physical power like All for One or Shigaraki. His threat was more insidious, more fundamental. He was a small, unassuming man in a simple gray suit, looking more like a disenfranchised academic than a villain capable of bringing the top 10 pro heroes to their knees. His quirk, however, was annihilation given form. He controlled time, but not in the grand, sweeping way of science fiction. He manipulated the age of things. He could turn a steel girder to rust and dust with a touch. He could accelerate a hero's fatigue, making seconds feel like hours of agonizing exertion. He could rewind his own injuries, his flesh knitting back together, as if the blow had never landed. "Look at you," Kronos said, his voice calm, almost sympathetic, yet carrying over the din of distant sirens and crackling fires. The great symbol of peace. So fragile. So temporary. A fleeting spark in the infinite, cold darkness of history. You fight to preserve moments, but moments are all you are. To Izuku's right, Shoto Todoroki stood braced, his body a study in defiant exhaustion. The left side of his face was slick with sweat, the right rimed with frost from the effort of containing his own power. He had thrown mountains of ice at Kronos, only to watch them sublime into vapor, aged 1,000,000 years in a second. He had unleashed torrents of fire, only to see them gutter and die, their heat leached away into the timeline. "He's just talking to wear us down," Shoto breathed, his voice a ragged rasp. "Don't listen." To his left, Katsuki Bakugo was a barely contained explosion of fury and pain. His gauntlets were dented, one of the bracers cracked and venting smoke. Blood trickled from his hairline, tracing a stark red path through the grime on his face. "Shut your damn mouth, you philosophical piece of trash!" Bakugo roared, his voice raw. He thrust his palms forward, but the resulting explosions were more like violent coughs than his usual concussive detonations. "We're gonna turn your clock back to zero, permanently." Kronos simply smiled, a thin, pitying expression. Such fire. Such passion. It will cool, as all things do. You see, that is my purpose. To teach the arrogant mayflies of this age the true weight of forever. You heroes rise and fall, your names forgotten in a few generations. Your peace is a sandcastle against the tide of eternity. I will be the tide. Izuku's eyes scanned the battlefield. He could see the others, pinned down, injured. Red Riot, his unbreakable form flickering. Ingenium, his leg armor mangled. He met Uraraka's gaze from across the rubble. She was using her zero-gravity on chunks of debris, creating a floating shield to protect a group of wounded civilians, but her face was pale, the telltale signs of nausea from overuse starkly visible. Her eyes, wide and fearful, were locked on him. On them. A silent plea and a promise, all in one. "We have to end this now." The thought was a chorus in his mind, his own voice mingling with the echoes of the vestiges within One for All. "He's wearing us down." Ninth, came the steady voice of Daigoro Banjo, the fifth. "He doesn't need to beat us. He just needs to outlast us. His quirk is conceptual. Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, whispered, his voice a thread of spectral static. Be careful. A direct hit from his core ability is not something flesh and bone can withstand. It's time, Izuku said, his voice low but clear. He pushed himself to his full height, ignoring the screaming protest of his sinews. The green lightning of One for All crackled around him, brighter now, more desperate. Kaken. Todoroki. We have one shot left. Full power. No holding back. We overwhelm his temporal field. Bakugo grinned, a feral, bloody slash in the dirt on his face. Finally. Took you long enough, you damn nerd? He slammed his fists together, the sound a sharp crack of promise. Let's dance, you time-wasting bastard. Todoroki nodded, his expression grimly determined. A wave of intense cold washed from his right side, followed by a blast of searing heat from his left. Together, they moved as one, a trinity of power that had defined a generation of heroism. Todoroki unleashed his ultimate move, Flash Freeze Heatwave, a cataclysmic collision of absolute zero and infernal heat aimed not at Kronos, but at the space around him, creating a vortex of elemental chaos designed to disrupt his control. Bakugo shot into the air with a series of perfectly timed explosions, his signature AP shot piercing through the tempest like armor-piercing needles of pure energy. Howitzer impact! He screamed, his body becoming a living meteor, and at the heart of it all was Deku, one for all, 100%. The power was a supernova in his veins. He became a blur of green energy, using Black Whip to slingshot himself through the storm of ice and fire. Float carried him effortlessly. Danger Sense screamed, a high-frequency alarm mapping every temporal distortion Kronos threw at him. He was a weapon honed by 9 generations, the ultimate expression of heroic will. Kronos's calm finally broke. His eyes widened as the unified assault bore down on him. He threw up his hands, and a visible dome of shimmering, warped air expanded from his body. Fools! You cannot break time itself. Todoroki's attack hit the dome and aged into nothing, steam and cold mist. Bakugo's howitzer impact struck it, and the explosive force seemed to unravel, the sound dying before it could even begin. But it was enough. For a single, critical second, the temporal shield flickered, and Izuku was through. He was inside the bubble, a space where the air felt thick and heavy as water, where every second felt like a year. His body screamed as the aging effect took hold, his costume turning brittle, his skin feeling tight and ancient. He ignored it. His fist, glowing with the condensed power of 9 souls, was cocked back. Manchester. Smash! The blow connected. Not with a boom, but with a strange, ringing silence, as if the sound itself had been erased from existence. Kronos staggered back, a real, genuine expression of pain on his face. A crack, like fracturing glass, spread across his temporal field. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth. You see? Izuku gasped, the words tearing from his throat. It doesn't matter how long you have. It's what you do with the time you're given. For a moment, he thought they had won, but Kronos started to laugh. A low, gurgling chuckle that grew into a full-throated, insane peal of laughter. The energy around him, once a defensive shield, began to contract, to concentrate. It swirled into a vortex of pure, terrifying temporal power centered on his chest, a black hole of non-existence. You're right, Kronos wheezed, his eyes wild with manic glee. It is what you do with your time. And with my last moments, I will give you the greatest gift, and the most profound curse. Danger Sense didn't just scream, it shrieked a symphony of pure, undiluted terror in his skull. It was a premonition of an end beyond death. He saw the attack coming, but he wasn't the target. The vortex, a swirling nexus of temporal chaos he would later learn was called Epic's End, wasn't aimed at him. It was aimed past him, at the spot where Bakugo was landing, his body smoking from his ultimate attack, and where Uraraka was rushing forward, her face a mask of concern. They were vulnerable, exhausted, and directly in the path of an attack that wouldn't just kill them, but potentially erase them from the timeline itself. There was no time to think. There was never time. There was only the instinct, the core programming of his soul that All Might had recognized all those years ago on that rooftop. A hero's body moves before they have a chance to think. He used the last dregs of his strength, the final ember of one for all, to push off the cracked ground. He threw himself sideways, a human shield, placing his own body directly in the path of the shimmering, unraveling vortex. He heard Uraraka scream his name. DKU! He heard Bakugo's raw, panicked shout. Izuku, no! Then the vortex hit him. There was no pain. Pain was a sensation, a signal traveling through nerves, and both sensation and nerves require time to exist. This was unexistence. He felt his body coming apart, not in a gory, physical way, but as if his very atoms were being unwound from the tapestry of reality. He saw his own hand, glowing with the embers of one for all, begin to fray at the edges, turning into motes of light that dissolved into nothing. His last coherent thought was of his friends safe behind him. That's okay then. From the epicenter of the blast, Kronos' final words echoed, not through the air, but directly into the dissolving remnants of Izuku's consciousness. A curse delivered on the wavelength of a dying soul. You want to be a hero who saves everyone? Then you will have all the time in the world to do it. You will outlast every soul you save, every villain you defeat, and every friend you hold dear. You will be the unsetting sun, a beacon that never fades but must always watch the day end. Live and watch it all turn to dust around you. Forever. Then, there was only a vast, silent, empty blackness. The world rushed back in a cacophony of sound and agony. Or rather, the lack of it. There was a profound, echoing silence where the vortex had been. Kronos had collapsed, his body a withered husk, the final expenditure of his life force having consumed him utterly. He was dead, but so was Deku. His body lay in the center of the crater, limp and broken. His limbs were bent at impossible angles. The vibrant green of his costume was gone, replaced by a universal, chilling gray, as if it had been aged 10,000 years. His chest was still. His face, usually so full of emotion, was a placid, empty mask. For a moment, no one moved. The surviving heroes and civilians stared, their victory choked by the sight of their symbol's ultimate sacrifice. Then the spell broke. Izuku! Bakugo's voice was a raw, broken thing. He scrambled over the rubble, his usual explosive grace gone, replaced by a clumsy, desperate urgency. He fell to his knees beside Izuku's body, his hands hovering, trembling, afraid to touch. No! No, you damn idiot, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. He reached out a shaking hand and pressed 2 fingers to Izuku's neck, searching for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. His face, for the first time in as long as anyone could remember, crumpled. The rage, the pride, the arrogance, it all dissolved, leaving behind only the terrified, heartbroken face of a boy who had just lost his oldest friend. No, Uraraka was next, her cries muffled as Todoroki half-supported, half-carried her forward. She collapsed beside Bakugo, her hands covering her mouth, her sobs racking her small frame. Deku-kun! She wailed, the name a shard of glass in the sudden, awful quiet. Todoroki stood over them, his expression shattered. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. He had seen death. He had faced it. But this felt wrong. It felt like the world had been knocked off its axis. He looked up at the sky, at the setting sun that was painting the smoke-filled clouds in hues of orange, purple, and blood red. The day was ending. The fight was over. They had won. It felt like the most profound loss of his life. The other heroes gathered around, a silent, grieving vigil. They took off their helmets, bowed their heads. The symbol of peace was gone, and then, as the last sliver of the sun dipped below the horizon, something impossible happened. It started with a single, faint mote of golden light, hovering over Izuku's chest. Then another, and another. Soon, a soft, warm luminescence began to emanate from his body. It was not the crackling green lightning of one for all. This was a gentle, steady, golden glow, like sunlight trapped under his skin. Bakugo flinched back. What the hell? The light intensified. Before their disbelieving eyes, the wounds began to close. A snapped leg bone straightened with a sickening, audible crunch, the flesh weaving itself back together over the break. Gashes and lacerations sealed over, leaving unblemished skin behind. The gray, aged fabric of his costume began to regain its color, the vibrant green bleeding back into the fibers as if being repainted by an unseen hand. Golden threads of light, like ethereal stitches, crisscrossed his body, pulling him back together from the brink of oblivion. It was not healing. Healing is a process, a messy biological function. This was restoration. It was as if reality itself had a blueprint of Izuku Midoriya, age 20, and was forcibly and violently correcting the damage, resetting him to factory specifications. Uraraka's sobs hitched. Todoroki's eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and absolute horror. "What is this?" he breathed. The process reached its crescendo. The golden light flared, bright enough to make them shield their eyes. And in the heart of that celestial radiance, the stilled chest of Izuku Midoriya rose with a sharp, shuddering, impossible gasp. His eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of someone waking from sleep. They were wild, confused, filled with the phantom terror of his last moments. He pushed himself up, his body moving with a sudden, fluid grace that belied the fact that he had been dead seconds before. He looked at his own hands, then at the horrified, stunned faces of his friends. "Kaken? Uraraka-san?" His voice was hoarse, confused. What happened?" "The attack," he trailed off, his gaze falling upon their expressions. There was relief, yes, a tidal wave of it. But underneath it, churning in their eyes, was something else. A new and terrible emotion he had never seen directed at him before. It was fear. The silence in the sterile, white medical room was heavier than any physical weight. It was a secret room, deep in the sublevels of Tokyo's Central Hospital, reserved for cases that were beyond top secret. The air hummed with the low thrum of advanced diagnostic equipment, their holographic displays casting shifting blue-green light on the four figures within. Izuku sat on the edge of the examination bed, wearing a simple hospital gown. He had been scrubbed clean of the grime and blood of battle, but he couldn't scrub away the feeling of his friend's stares. He felt like a specimen under a microscope, a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. Across from him, in a chair pulled close, sat recovery girl, Chio Shizenji. Her face, usually a mask of grandmotherly concern, was drawn and grim. Her gaze flickered between the impossibly complex data scrolling on a floating monitor, and the young man in front of her. Leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, was Shoto Todoroki. His expression was a mask of stoicism, but his mismatched eyes were troubled, constantly analyzing, trying to fit this impossible event into a logical framework and failing. Pacing the length of the small room was Katsuki Bakugo. The restless energy radiating from him was a mix of barely contained relief and furious frustration. He kept running a hand through his spiky hair, muttering curses under his breath. Uraraka had been given a sedative and was resting in another room. The shock had been too much for her. "I don't understand," Izuku said, his voice quiet, breaking the suffocating silence. "I felt it was over. I was gone." Recovery girl sighed, a weary, ancient sound. She gestured to the holographic display. "I've run every test I know, and a few I had to consult theoretical biophysics papers to even devise. Your vitals are perfect. Healthier than perfect, in fact. Cellular degradation is non-existent. Your telomeres aren't just protected, they appear to be locked. Fixed in place." She looked at him, her old eyes filled with a profound, sorrowful gravity. "Midoriya, my boy, when you were brought in, you were clinically dead. No heartbeat, no brain activity, catastrophic tissue damage on a level from which no quirk could facilitate recovery. What we saw on that battlefield, what the monitors are telling me now, it isn't regeneration." "Then what is it?" Todoroki asked, his voice sharp. "It's restoration," she said, the word hanging in the air. As if his body, his very existence, has been anchored to a single point in time. Any deviation from that state, be it injury, disease, or even the natural process of aging, is being corrected. Violently. His life force, the energy that every living thing possesses, is not a finite pool. The readings are nonsensical. They're infinite. Bakugo stopped pacing. "What are you trying to say, you old hag? Spit it out." Recovery girl looked directly at Izuku, her expression one of deep pity. "The villain's curse, it appears to have worked. Izuku Midoriya, you can no longer die from natural causes. Any injury you sustain will be perfectly repaired. You are, for all intents and purposes, biologically immortal. The word hit the room like a physical blow. Immortal. Izuku stared at his hands. His strong, scarred, hero's hands. They looked the same. They felt the same. But they were now the hands of something else. Something that didn't belong to the natural order. Is this true? He projected into the quiet space of his mind. A familiar, spectral presence answered, his voice full of sorrow. I fear so, my boy, the vestige of All Might responded, his form a shimmering golden outline in the back of Izuku's consciousness. One for all is fused to you now. I can feel it. The curse has wrapped itself around the core of the quirk, using its power as an engine. It cannot be passed on. It has reached its final destination. It will live as long as you do, and he would live forever. Bakugo slammed his fist against the wall, the sound cracking through the silence. Bullshit. There's no such thing as forever. Every quirk has a weakness, a counter. We just have to find the bastard who can undo it. And what if we can't, Bakugo? Todoroki said, his voice dangerously level. What if this is permanent? We need to consider the implications. The implication, Bakugo snarled, turning on him, is that Deku is alive. That's the only one that matters right now. He's alive, you icy hot bastard. His voice broke on the last word, the raw relief he'd been suppressing with anger finally cracking through. He wouldn't look at Izuku, instead glaring at Todoroki, his chest heaving. Izuku felt a pang of warmth for his friend's fierce, desperate loyalty. But it was quickly drowned by a rising tide of cold dread. He looked at Recovery Girl, at Todoroki's calculating gaze, at Bakugo's furious denial. They were all processing it, grappling with the impossible reality. And in that moment, in the sterile quiet of that secret room, he felt the first true touch of the curse. It wasn't the battle, or the death, or the unnatural rebirth. It was the sudden, invisible wall of glass that had just descended between him and them. He was here, and they were there. He was alive, a fact that brought them all overwhelming relief. But he was no longer one of them. He was the boy who wouldn't grow old. The friend who would watch them gray and wither. The hero who could never rest, never fall, never find peace. He was the unsetting sun. And he was just beginning to realize that the price of eternal light was an eternity of watching the darkness fall on everyone he loved. A wave of nausea, colder and deeper than any he had ever known, washed over him. He was alive, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. 15 years. It was a lifetime, and it was the blink of an eye. In 15 years, cities scarred by the paranormal liberation war had been rebuilt, their new towers scraping a sky that seemed, for the first time in a generation, genuinely peaceful. In 15 years, a new cohort of heroes had graduated from UA, served with distinction, and were now mentoring their own successors. In 15 years, the world had healed, and at the center of it all stood Deku, the unsetting sun, the eternal symbol of peace. His public image was one of absolute, unassailable strength. He was the hero who could not be broken, the man who walked out of explosions with a reassuring smile, the final bulwark against which all evil shattered. The story, carefully curated by the Hero Public Safety Commission and reinforced by every public appearance, was that the final battle against the villain Kronos had unlocked a latent aspect of his quirk. Hyperregeneration, the media called it. An evolution of One for All that made him virtually indestructible. It was a comforting lie, a source of stability in an unstable world. The truth was a secret carried by a handful of aging souls, a burden that grew heavier with each passing year. Today, the lie was on full display. He's in the Nakatomi Tower. 34th floor, shouted the voice of Ingenium over the comms. Tenya Ida's voice had lost none of its authoritative urgency, but it now carried a deeper, calmer timbre of a seasoned veteran. The villain, a bioterrorist calling himself Caustic, had turned the floor into a death trap of corrosive acid. The air itself shimmered with noxious fumes, and the metal walls wept slick, bubbling trails of green liquid that ate through everything they touched. Shoto Todoroki, his hero costume now a more streamlined, tactical affair in dark blue and white, had the building contained. A massive, perfect wall of ice encased the entire 34th floor, preventing the acid from eating through the tower's structural supports. The ice hissed and steamed where the acid touched it, a constant battle of elemental forces. Creati, status on the antidote? Shoto's voice was as cool and efficient as ever. Synthesizing now, Momo Yaoyorozu's voice replied, slightly strained. His compound is complex. It will take another 2 minutes. Uravity is evacuating the adjacent floors. We don't have 2 minutes, came the rough, gravelly retort of Dynamite. Katsuki Bakugo swooped past the window, propelling himself with controlled blasts, his gaze fixed on the interior. The bastard's got hostages. He's rigged the whole floor to dissolve. Deku, you're up. There was no hesitation. Izuku stood on the roof of the opposite building, a living beacon in his iconic green. His costume had been redesigned countless times, but the core elements remained. He was the picture of heroic perfection, his body at its absolute peak, not a single line of age on his face. He looked exactly as he had 15 years ago. On my way, he said, his voice a calm reassurance broadcast to the entire team. He leaped. Float carried him across the chasm between buildings. Black Whip, now as natural to him as his own limbs, shot out, anchoring him to the side of the Nakatomi Tower. He didn't bother with the door. One for all flared, a familiar green lightning storm enveloping him as he smashed through the reinforced concrete wall into the heart of the chaos. The scene inside was hellish. Civilians were huddled in a corner, shielded by a shimmering pink barrier courtesy of an invisible Toru Hagakure. In the center of the room, Caustic, a man in a grotesque hazmat suit with bubbling vials strapped to his chest, laughed maniacally. You're too late, symbol of peace. My glorious solution will cleanse this entire floor. It's over, Caustic, Izuku said, his voice echoing with power. He took a step forward, and the acid pooling on the floor sizzled around his armored boots, eating through the metal with terrifying speed. He ignored it. The villain hurled a glob of concentrated acid directly at him. It was a move that would have been fatal to any other hero. It struck Izuku square in the chest. There was a horrific hissing sound as his costume and the flesh beneath it dissolved in a cloud of acrid smoke, revealing muscle and bone for a split second. The hostages screamed. But then, the golden light flared. It was a phenomenon the world had come to know and revere. A soft, warm glow that emanated from the wound. Before their eyes, skin, muscle, and fabric knitted themselves back together. Not healed, but restored. Within 3 seconds the hole in his chest was gone, the costume pristine, the man unmarked. Izuku didn't even flinch. He just kept walking forward, his green eyes glowing with unwavering resolve. Caustic stared, his maniacal grin faltering. No. Impossible. Nothing can withstand my formula. Everything has a limit, Izuku said, his voice low. Except my duty to save you from yourself. The fight was over in an instant. A single, precise Delaware smash, calibrated to shatter Caustic's containment suit without rupturing the vials, and the villain was down. The hostages were safe. The mission was a success. As the other heroes flooded the room, securing the villain and tending to the civilians, Shoto walked over to him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Another clean sweep. You make it look too easy. Izuku offered a smile, the one the cameras loved, the one that graced 1,000 magazine covers. Teamwork. But as he looked around at his friends, at the legendary team that had defined this gilded age of peace, he saw the subtle markers of time's relentless march. He saw the faint crow's feet at the corners of Shoto's eyes, the slight silvering at Bakugo's temples that he always pretended wasn't there, the mature, settled confidence in Ida that had replaced his youthful rigidity. They were in their mid-30s, at the prime of their lives and careers, and he was still 20. A living photograph from a day long past. The bar was called the Second Wind, a cozy, private establishment in a quiet district of Mizurufu, owned by a retired hero who understood the need for discretion. They had a private room in the back, its walls lined with signed hero portraits from decades past. It was their place, a sanctuary from the public eye. Laughter filled the room, warm and genuine. The tension of the mission had bled away, replaced by the easy camaraderie of friends who had faced death together more times than they could count. Pints of beer and glasses of whiskey sat on the dark wood table, and the air was thick with the smell of fried food and relief. To another one in the bag. Eijiro Kirishima, Red Riot, boomed, raising his glass. His hair was still defiantly red, but his face had the rugged lines of a man who had spent 15 years being the unbreakable shield for others. And to Deku, for taking that acid bath like a champ. Seriously, man, does that even hurt anymore? Izuku chuckled, a well-practiced, easy sound. Feels like a bad sunburn for a second. Then it's gone. Another lie. It felt like being torn apart by fire ants, every single time. The pain was real. It was the recovery that was unnatural. A toast is a fine idea, Tenya Ida declared, rising to his feet with the same formal posture he'd had as a teenager, though now it seemed less like a tic and more like ingrained dignity. To teamwork, and to the continued peace our efforts have secured. All right, Four Eyes, sit down before you give a whole speech, Bakugo grumbled, slouched in his chair. He took a long drink of his beer, his sharp red eyes scanning the room, as always. We get it. We're great. The easy banter washed over Izuku, a familiar comfort that was beginning to feel thin, like a well-worn blanket. He took a sip of his own drink, water. He never drank on the job, and his job was never over, and watched them. He watched Mina and Toru animatedly retelling a story, Achiko Uraraka laughing, her cheeks flushed, a soft, happy sound that still made his chest ache in a phantom way. He saw Tsuyu Azuri listening patiently, a small, knowing smile on her face. They had all grown. They had houses, partners, investments. They had lives outside the costume. His life was the costume. It was then that Shoto stood up, his hand finding Momo Yayorosa's. Momo, who had become one of the most respected and brilliant support heroes in the world, looked up at him, her dark eyes shining with a nervous, radiant happiness. The room quieted, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Shoto, ever direct, cleared his throat. We have something to announce, he said, his voice steady, though he couldn't quite meet everyone's eyes at once. He looked at Momo, and his expression softened in a way that was still, after all these years, a little startling to witness. Momo and I are engaged. The words landed, followed by a beat of stunned silence, and then an eruption of joyous chaos. Finally! Mina shrieked, jumping up to hug a blushing Momo. It's about damn time! Kirishima roared, slapping a stoic but pleased Shoto on the back so hard he almost spilled his drink. Congratulations flew around the room, a whirlwind of hugs, cheers, and excited questions. Izuku was on his feet with everyone else, a wide, genuine smile plastered on his face. He was truly, deeply happy for them. They were perfect for each other, a balance of fire and ice, passion and intellect. He hugged Shoto tightly. Congratulations, man. I'm so happy for you both. Thank you, Midoriya, Shoto said, a rare, unguarded smile on his face. I'd like you to be my best man. The request hit Izuku like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs for a second. Best man. To stand beside his friend as he stepped into a future, a shared life, a journey of growing old together. A future Izuku was forever barred from. He recovered in an instant, the practiced smile clicking back into place. Of course. I'd be honored. He moved on to congratulate Momo, enveloping her in a warm hug. This is amazing news, Yamamoto. He's lucky to have you. Oh, Izuku, thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We're so happy. He celebrated with them, laughed with them, raised a glass of water and a toast to their future. But as he sat back down, a profound, chilling loneliness began to seep into his bones. It was an alienating cold that no fire quirk could warm. He was watching his friends move down a path, hand in hand, a path with milestones he would never reach, engagement, marriage, family. He was a fixed point, a lighthouse on the shore, and their ships were all sailing away toward a shared horizon he could only watch from a distance. Later in the evening, as the initial excitement died down, Ida sat down in the chair next to him. His glasses glinted in the dim light. It is a joyous occasion, is it not? Ida said, straightening his tie out of habit. It really is, Izuku agreed, his voice quieter now. Ida watched Shoto and Momo, who were now engrossed in a conversation with Uraraka and Tsuyu about potential wedding venues. It makes one think about the future. About legacy. He turned his gaze to Izuku, his expression serious. My brother, Tensei, is getting on in years. He's content, but I see the pride he takes in my work. In how I've carried the ingenium name. He paused, adjusting his glasses. My wife and we've been talking about it. About having children. About a day when I might hang up my own boots and pass the mantle to a new generation, to ensure the name ingenium continues to stand for heroism. Izuku listened, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. Legacy. For Ida, it was a name, a family, a line of succession. For All Might, it had been a quirk, a torch to be passed. Izuku was the end of the line. One for all would die with him, if he could ever die. His legacy wasn't a name to be passed on, it was a solitary, unending watch. He was the final monument to a power that was never meant to be permanent. That's a wonderful thing, Ida, Izuku managed to say, the words feeling like ash in his mouth. You'd be a great father. Thank you, Midoriya. Ida gave him a respectful nod, oblivious to the chasm his words had opened at Izuku's feet. The final crack in the gilded facade came from Achiko. She approached him near the end of the night, her smile a little weary, a little wistful. She looked beautiful. The youthful roundness of her face had matured into elegant lines, and her eyes held the quiet confidence of a woman who had saved countless lives and knew her own worth. It's a lot, isn't it? She said softly, gesturing to the happy couple. Big changes. Good changes, he replied, his gaze soft. Yeah, good changes, she agreed. She leaned against the wall beside him, letting out a long sigh. You know, my parents are officially retired now. Bought a little place by the sea. I went to visit them last week, and my back ached the whole time. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. 15 years of floating myself and giant pieces of concrete. It adds up. My joints feel it in the morning. She looked at him, her brown eyes searching his. Sometimes I think about it. What it would be like to just stop. To build houses instead of keeping them from falling. To use my quirk to help my dad with his construction company, like I always dreamed. I've made enough money. I've helped enough people. Maybe it's time to think about a finish line. Her words were a gentle, unintentional dagger. A finish line. The concept was so foreign to him now it might as well have been a word from an alien language. Everyone else in this room had a finish line. Retirement. Old age. A peaceful end. His track was a circle. An infinite loop. You've more than earned it, Uraraka-san, he said, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. You deserve to be happy. To rest. Thanks, Deku-kun, she said, giving his arm a light, friendly squeeze. The casual touch felt electric, a reminder of a closeness that had once been a universe of unspoken possibilities, but was now just a warm, platonic affection for a living legend. A statue. He watched her walk back to the group, leaving him alone with his thoughts. He was the symbol of peace, the guardian of this gilded age. He had the respect of the world, the love of his friends, the power to solve any problem. He was living the dream he'd had as a quirkless, crying child. So why did it feel so much like a cage? The sparring session was a ritual. Twice a week, in a private gym they had personally funded and built, a state-of-the-art facility they'd ironically nicknamed Dagoba Gym. Izuku and Bakugo would beat the hell out of each other. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about calibration, about pushing each other to their limits in a way no one else could. It was their own unique language, a conversation spoken in explosions and smashes. Today, the conversation was heated. You're holding back, you damn nerd! Bakugo roared, blasting himself sideways to dodge a 45% kick that cracked the reinforced wall behind him. I'm not! Izuku shot back, launching himself forward, black whip tendrils snaking out to try and ensnare Bakugo's legs. The hell you're not! You've had that same constipated look on your face since Shoto's party. Bakugo spun in midair, unleashing a massive AP shot that Izuku had to cross his arms to block. The force of it sent him skidding back several feet, the soles of his boots melting. Spit it out, or I'll blast it out of you. They disengaged, standing at opposite ends of the cavernous training room, both breathing heavily. Sweat plastered Bakugo's spiky blonde hair to his forehead. Izuku, as always, felt the exertion, but his body was already mending the microscopic tears in his muscles, flushing the lactic acid. He would not be sore tomorrow. He was never sore. It's nothing, Kaken, Izuku said, trying to sound convincing. Don't cacken me with that pathetic tone, Bakugo snarled, stalking towards him. I've known you my whole damn life. I know when you're lying. It's about all the happily ever after bullshit, isn't it? Icy hot and ponytail, round face talking about retirement. It's getting to you. Izuku didn't answer. He just looked at his friend. Bakugo, for all his abrasive fury, had always been terrifyingly perceptive when it came to him. Bakugo stopped a few feet away, his chest rising and falling. The anger in his eyes softened, just a fraction, into something more complicated. Concern. This is what we trained for. To be the best. To win, and we won. This is the prize, Izuku. A quiet world. I know, Izuku said, and his voice was raw. I know. Bakugo scrubbed a hand over his face, wiping away sweat. He grunted, turning his head to the side. Look, if it's bugging you that much, just remember you're not the only one stuck in this. I'm not planning on retiring to some quiet farm anytime soon. Someone's gotta keep you on your toes. It was as close to a heartfelt declaration of solidarity as Bakugo was capable of, and it meant the world to Izuku. A small, real smile touched his lips. Thanks, Kaken. As Bakugo turned his head, the harsh overhead lights of the gym caught something. A single, distinct strand of silver nestled among the explosive blonde spikes at his temple. It wasn't stark white, but a soft, shimmering gray. Izuku froze, his eyes locked onto it. It was just a hair. A single, insignificant strand of hair. But it was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. It was more horrifying than All for One's empty sockets, more chilling than Shigaraki's decay, more final than Kronos' curse. It was time. Real, inescapable, relentless time, made manifest on his oldest friend, his fiercest rival. It was the one enemy he could never, ever punch. What? Bakugo demanded, noticing his stare. You got a problem? Izuku couldn't speak. He could only stare at that single, gleaming thread. It was a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence, signaling that a chapter of life was concluding. Bakugo's chapter, and his own book had no more punctuation. It was just one long, unending, run-on sentence. Bakugo seemed to realize what he was looking at. He reached up, his fingers brushing his temple. A flicker of something, annoyance, surprise, maybe even a hint of vulnerability, crossed his face before he masked it with his usual arrogant smirk. Oh, that? He scoffed, dropping his hand. Adds character, you damn nerd. It's called being a distinguished veteran. Something you wouldn't know anything about, staying a damn kid forever. He laughed it off, turning to grab a water bottle. But Izuku saw it. He saw the way Bakugo's eyes lingered on his own reflection in the dark observation window for a second too long. He saw the subtle tightening in his jaw, the first gray hair. The first real, tangible sign that the world was moving on without him, aging without him. Kaken was getting older. And one day, that single gray hair would be one of many. And one day, there would be no more hair. No more Kaken. The sparring session was over. The unspoken conversation had delivered its final, devastating blow. Izuku's apartment was a museum. It was a nice place, a penthouse overlooking the peaceful city he had sworn to protect, paid for by the generous salary of the one hero. But it wasn't a home. It was an archive. One wall was covered in framed photos, Class 1A's first group picture, all of them bright-eyed and youthful. The original Deku and the Baku squad goofing off. Shoto's first real smile. A picture of him in all might, in his skeletal form, sharing a meal on a sunny afternoon. They were relics of a time that was becoming increasingly distant, a past he was tethered to while everyone else swam away from it. He walked past the photos and into his bathroom. The lights flickered on automatically, illuminating the clean, white space. He braced his hands on the marble sink, the stone cool beneath his palms, and looked up. He stared at his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was 20 years old. It was a good face, strong jaw, clear green eyes, a constellation of freckles that had never faded. It was the face of a hero at his peak. It was the face of a liar. It was the face of a freak. Slowly, with a trembling hand, he reached up and touched the corner of his eye. The skin was smooth, unlined. He traced the line of his jaw, sharp and defined. He ran his fingers through his own thick, unruly green hair. Not a single strand of gray. Not a single sign of the 15 years of war and vigilance he had endured. It was a perfect mask. A gilded cage of youth. He thought of Shoto's quiet happiness, of Ada's dreams of fatherhood, of Uraraka's weary longing for rest. He thought of Bakugo's first gray hair. They were all living. They were changing, growing, aging, moving towards an end. Their lives had seasons. Spring, summer, autumn, winter. He was trapped in an endless, unchanging midsummer day. The sun was always high, the light was always bright, but there was no relief, no comforting twilight, no peaceful night to come. The unsetting sun? The curse had once sounded poetic, grand. Now, for the first time, he understood its true, insidious meaning. He was a beacon that would never fade, but he was also a prisoner of his own light, forced to watch every beautiful sunset, every descent into peaceful darkness, forever out of his reach. His reflection stared back, his expression cracking. The hero's smile was gone, replaced by the lost, lonely eyes of Izuku Midoriya. He saw the cage now, its bars polished and golden, its beauty a mockery, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his immortal soul, that the door had been locked, and he was the only one inside. 40 years. 40 years is long enough for vinyl records to become cool again, for fashion to cycle through a half-dozen cycles of absurdity and elegance, for entire genres of music to be born, flourish, and fade into nostalgia. It is long enough for gleaming new technologies to become obsolete museum pieces. It is long enough for a generation to be born, to live, and to begin looking towards its own twilight. For Izuku Midoriya, 40 years was the time it took to perfect the art of being a ghost at a feast. He remained the world's unerring North Star. At a physical age forever locked at 20, he was a paradox, the most experienced hero alive, with the face of a rookie. He moved through the world with a quiet, practiced grace, his youthful features a mask that hid the weight of 6 decades of life. The initial shock of his condition had long ago settled into a strange, sad legend. He was Deku, the immortal symbol, a figure as much a part of the global landscape as Mount Fuji or the Great Wall, a wonder to be marveled at, but not to be truly known. His days were a structured routine of vigilance. He no longer chased every purse snatcher. He was a force of nature, deployed for extinction-level threats, nation-destabilizing villains, and natural disasters of unprecedented scale. The rest of his time was spent in the archive, a vast, subterranean complex he had built beneath his old apartment building. It was a library of heroism, containing strategic analyses of every major conflict, psychological profiles of thousands of villains, and a detailed history of the hero age, cross-referenced with the wisdom of the 8 vestiges of one for all who were his only constant companions. He was in the archive, reviewing seismic data for potential fault line instability off the coast of California, when the call came. The communicator was a private line, a relic he maintained for a shrinking circle of people. The caller ID flashed a name that made his timeless heart skip a beat, Uraraka Achiko. He hadn't spoken to her in 6 months. Their calls had become less frequent over the last decade, a slow, gentle drifting apart born not of anger, but of the simple, insurmountable fact that their lives were no longer on the same river. He answered, his voice perfectly calm. Uraraka-san. Is everything all right? Her voice on the other end was thick with tears, aged and fragile like dried leaves. She was 78 years old, a beloved grandmother with a kind smile and a bad hip, who told her grandkids stories of the days when she could dance in the sky. Izuku, she sobbed, the sound a crackling fire of grief over the line. The use of his first name, a familiarity she only used in moments of extreme emotion, was a death knell. It's Katsuki. The doctors, they said it's time. He's asking for you. The world, for a moment, tilted on its axis. The seismic data on the holographic screen blurred into meaningless squiggles. He knew this day was coming. He had prepared for it for 40 years, rehearsed it in the quiet, lonely hours of the night, fortified his heart against its inevitability. He had seen the decline with his own eyes, the explosive power of dynamite fading, the retirement ceremony where Bakugo had stood proud but weary, the slow, reluctant surrender to a body that could no longer keep up with his indomitable spirit. But preparation was a shield of paper against the tidal wave. I'm on my way, he said, his voice a low, steady anchor in her storm of grief. He hung up, and for a full minute he did not move. He stood in the silent, temperature-controlled hum of the archive, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, and felt the approach of the first true, final ghost. Be strong, Ninth, came the spectral voice of All Might, a comforting hand on his mental shoulder. He would want you to be strong. Izuku closed his eyes. I know, he thought, the words a silent, desperate prayer. I know. He didn't take a jet. He didn't need one. He simply went to the surface, took a deep breath of the cool night air, and leaped into the sky. Float, honed by decades of use, was as natural as breathing. The city lights of Tokyo smeared into rivers of gold and neon beneath him as he flew towards Miyazurifu General Hospital, a silent green comet on the saddest journey of his life. The palliative care ward was a place designed to deny its own purpose. The walls were painted in soft, calming pastels. The air was scented with lavender, a thin veneer over the inescapable undercurrent of antiseptic and sickness. The sound was a hushed symphony of quiet footsteps, hushed conversations, and the gentle, rhythmic beeping of machines that were no longer measuring a fight for life, but charting a slow, dignified retreat. He saw his friends gathered in the waiting area, a small, huddled group of silver-haired legends. Shoto Todoroki, his face a road map of dignified wrinkles, the scar over his left eye faded but still present, stood beside his wife, Momo. Tenya Ida, leaning heavily on a cane, his posture still impossibly straight, was murmuring quietly to a weeping Ochiko. Eijiro Kurishima, his bright red hair now a soft, snowy white, sat with his head in his hands. They saw him approach, and a strange, reverent silence fell over them. They looked at him, at his smooth, unlined face, his youthful posture, his vibrant green eyes that held the weight of all their shared years, and the impossible gulf between them was starkly, painfully visible. He was their friend, their leader, the boy they had grown up with. And he was a relic, a time traveler, their grandson. Ochiko rose and came to him, wrapping him in a fragile hug. He held her gently, afraid he might break her. He's been waiting, she whispered into his shoulder. He's been so angry at everything, but he's been holding on. For you, he nodded, unable to speak. He met Shoto's gaze over Ochiko's shoulder. Shoto's mismatched eyes, one blue, one gray, held a universe of shared understanding and sorrow. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a silent granting of permission. Go. Be with him. The room was at the end of the hall. The name on the door read, Bakugo, Katsuki. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a heart monitor tracing a slow, faltering rhythm. The scent of lavender could not conquer the smell of illness here. It was the room of a man who had raged against the dying of the light with every fiber of his being, and had lost. And there he was. The man in the bed was a stranger, and he was undeniably Kaken. The explosive, spiky blonde hair was gone, replaced by a thin, wispy covering of white. The powerful, muscular frame was a shrunken, frail thing under the thin hospital blanket. His skin was pale and papery, stretched thin over the sharp angles of his bones and mapped with the liver spots of old age. An oxygen tube rested beneath his nose, and in 4 lines snaked into a hand covered in wrinkled, translucent skin. But the eyes that flickered open as Izuku approached were the same. They were cloudy with age and medication, but behind the fog, they were still the fierce, intelligent, defiant crimson of Katsuki Bakugo. Took you long enough, Bakugo rasped, his voice a dry, rattling whisper, a mere echo of its former roar. Each word was an effort. Damn nerd. Izuku pulled a chair to the bedside, his movements slow, deliberate. He sat down, his heart feeling like a shattered stone in his chest. I came as soon as I heard Kaken. Bakugo's gaze roamed over Izuku's face, a slow, lingering inspection. He saw the complete absence of time's touch. A faint, bitter smile touched his cracked lips. Look at you. Still a damn kid. It's disgusting. The insult had no heat. It was a statement of fact, weary and tinged with a strange, dark envy. How are you feeling? Izuku asked, the question feeling stupid and hollow as soon as it left his lips. Like shit, Bakugo wheezed, a ghost of a cough shaking his frail frame. Like my body, Finally cashed all the checks. My pride wrote for it. He took a slow, rattling breath. Mitsuki's gone. Old man's gone. Everyone is going. His gaze drifted to the window, to the dark sky outside. And you're just here? I'm here, Kaken, Izuku said softly. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the slow, tired beat of the heart monitor. It was a silence filled with 60 years of shared history, of childhood rivalry, of bitter resentment, of a UA classroom, of shared battlefields, of a hard-won respect that had slowly, imperceptibly, blossomed into the deepest and most profound friendship of Izuku's life. Remember? Ground Beta? Bakugo whispered, his eyes closing for a moment. Our first, real fight. I remember, Izuku said, a faint smile touching his lips. You were terrifying. I was an idiot, Bakugo rasped, his eyes still closed. A scared, arrogant idiot. Afraid you'd leave me behind. A single tear escaped the corner of his eye and traced a slow path through the wrinkles on his temple. Funny. In the end, I'm the one, leaving you. The truth of that statement hung between them, heavy and suffocating. Bakugo's eyes opened again, and he seemed to gather a flicker of his old strength. He fixed his gaze on Izuku, and the intensity was so familiar it made Izuku's breath catch. You, listen to me, Izuku. The use of his given name, so rare it was like a thunderclap. This thing, your curse. I see it in your eyes. The loneliness. The damned weight of it all. You think you have to carry the whole world, forever. He struggled to push himself up on one elbow, a pathetic echo of his old explosive movements. The effort left him gasping against the oxygen tube. Izuku instinctively reached out to help him, but Bakugo waved a weak, dismissive hand. Don't, he wheezed. Don't you dare pity me. And don't you dare let this break you. His frail, trembling hand moved across the blanket, and with a staggering effort he grabbed Izuku's. The contrast was shocking, almost obscene. Bakugo's hand was a bird's claw, all bone and wrinkled skin, cold to the touch. Izuku's was the strong, warm, unblemished hand of a 20-year-old man. It was the hand of the present gripping the hand of the past. Bakugo's grip, though weak, was insistent. His crimson eyes bored into Izuku's. Don't you dare falter, he whispered, his voice gaining a thread of its old, commanding steel. You hear me? Don't you let watching us turn to dust make you weak. You're the one who has to stay, the one who has to see it through. He paused, gathering his last reserves of breath, of will. His final words were not an insult, not a request, but a final, heavy, inescapable burden. A command from a dying king to his eternal champion. Be the hero, he rasped, his voice cracking. That we couldn't be. Be the hero, forever. And with that final command, the last of his strength seemed to desert him. His head fell back against the pillow. His grip on Izuku's hand loosened. His eyes fluttered, the fiery crimson fading, becoming dull, unfocused. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor beside the bed faltered. It skipped a beat. Then another. Then it devolved into a single, continuous, high-pitched tone. Beep. The sound was absolute. Final. It was the sound of a story ending. The end of the explosive, brilliant, furious, and heroic saga of Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku sat there, frozen, his hand still holding the now limp hand of his friend. He didn't cry. He didn't move. He felt a profound, tectonic shift deep within his soul, a cracking of a foundation he hadn't even known was there. The first farewell. The first pillar of his world had crumbled to dust before his very eyes. A nurse came in, her expression gentle and practiced. She checked the monitor, made a note on her chart, and with a soft, apologetic look at Izuku, she turned off the keening alarm. The silence that replaced it was louder than any explosion. The funeral was held on a gray, drizzling Tuesday. The sky wept a soft, mournful rain that beaded on the black umbrellas of the mourners. They gathered at a hero's cemetery, a place of honor filled with marble statues and granite headstones bearing the names of legends. Izuku stood under his own umbrella, slightly apart from the main group. He wore a simple, well-tailored black suit. It was the same suit he'd worn to All Might's state funeral 30 years ago. It still fit perfectly. He watched his friends, a gallery of grieving elders. He saw their children, now middle-aged themselves, and their grandchildren, young adults and teenagers who looked at him with a mixture of awe, confusion, and fear. He was a myth from their history books, standing right there in the flesh, looking younger than their own parents. When it was his turn to speak, a hush fell over the crowd. He walked to the front, his footsteps silent on the wet grass, and stood before the casket, which was draped in a flag bearing Dynamite's heroic insignia. He looked out at the sea of faces, at his aging, heartbroken friends, and the full, crushing weight of his reality settled upon him. He was no longer just a friend mourning a friend. He was a living monument, delivering a eulogy for a part of his own foundation. He began to speak, his voice clear and steady, amplified by a small, discreet device. It was the voice of the symbol of peace, calm and reassuring, a voice practiced in soothing the terrified and inspiring the hopeless. We are taught that heroism is about strength, he began, his gaze sweeping over his friends. About power. About victory. Katsuki Bakugo had all of those things in abundance. He was a force of nature, a blinding light of passion and determination. From the first day I knew him, he was striving, pushing, exploding towards his goal of being the #1 hero. And for a time, he paused, letting the words settle. But true heroism, the kind that lasts, isn't just about strength. It's about the will to grow. To change. The Katsuki I first knew was difficult. A few wet, choked laughs rippled through the crowd. He was arrogant and proud, and he pushed people away. But the man we lay to rest today, he learned. He learned that true strength is not about standing alone, but about learning to stand with others, to protect them, to lift them up. He became a hero who inspired not just with his power, but with his relentless, stubborn refusal to ever give up on himself, or on the people he chose to protect. He looked directly at Shoto, at Ochiko, at Ida. His voice softened, losing some of its practiced, public quality, becoming more personal. He was my rival. He was my partner. He was my harshest critic and my most unwavering motivator. He was my friend. My best friend. The words felt inadequate, pebbles trying to describe a mountain. The world is safer because he lived. We are all better because he lived. He finished his speech, his voice never wavering, his expression serene. He was the perfect picture of stoic grief. But inside, his soul was screaming. He was a fraud. A statue pretending to be a man. His grief was real, a gaping wound, but it was a wound that would never scar over, never fade. It would remain fresh and raw for an eternity, while theirs would soften with time, becoming a cherished, painful memory. As he walked back to his spot, the mourners parted for him with a new kind of deference. It wasn't just respect anymore. It was awe colored with pity. He saw it in their eyes. They weren't just looking at Izuku Midoriya. They were looking at forever. They were looking at a man who would have to do this again, and again, and again, until every face in this crowd was just another name on a stone. After the casket was lowered, people came to him, offering quiet, awkward condolences. It was a beautiful eulogy, Midoriya-san, said Ida's son, a man in his 40s with his father's earnest eyes. He would have liked it, Todoroki's daughter added softly, her hair a startling mix of red and white. He accepted their words with a graceful nod and a quiet thank you. But he knew they weren't comforting him. How could they? He was comforting them. He was the constant, the living repository of their parents' memory. He was their history book. When the crowd finally dispersed, leaving only the original members of their class, Shoto came and stood beside him, the two of them looking down at the fresh grave. He was always angry that you would outlast him, Shoto said, his voice a low rumble. I think, in the end, he was just angry that he had to leave you alone. He gave me one last order, Izuku said, his voice barely a whisper. He told me to keep going. To not falter. Of course he did, Shoto said, a sad smile touching his lips. It's the only way he knew how to say I love you. They stood in the rain for a long time, two old friends, one of whom was trapped in the body of a young man. The first farewell was complete. The first name had been crossed off a list that Izuku was terrified to imagine the full length of. Kaken was gone. And Izuku Midoriya, the unsetting sun, was left behind, with a new, heavier burden on his immortal shoulders, and an eternity of sunrises to face, alone. The grief was a cold, hard stone inside him, the first of a collection he knew he was now doomed to carry forever. 150 years after the curse. A century and a half is an eternity in human terms. It is the span of 5 generations. It is the time it takes for empires to crumble and new world orders to be born. It is the time it takes for a world reshaped by heroes to become a world that takes them for granted. For Izuku Midoriya, it was the time it took to learn the most painful lesson of his unending life. Punching was not a solution. It was a stopgap. A temporary salve on an eternal wound. He had watched them all go. After Bakugo, the farewells had come with a slow, agonizing regularity. Kirishima, the unbreakable Red Riot, had passed peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by his loving family. Uraraka, who had retired to a quiet life by the sea, had lived to the ripe old age of 92, her last years filled with the laughter of her great-grandchildren. Todoroki, ever the stoic pillar, had succumbed to a rare, non-quirk-related illness, his wife Momo following him just a year later, as if her heart had simply decided it was done beating without his. Ida, Tsuyu, Mina, Kaminari. One by one the bright, burning stars of his generation had winked out, leaving him in a silent, lonely sky. Each funeral was another chisel blow to his soul, carving away a piece of the young man he once was, leaving behind something harder, more ancient. He was the custodian of their memories, the last living witness to their greatness. He attended every service, a constant, youthful figure in a sea of changing faces, a living paradox that comforted and disturbed in equal measure. He became the first, a title whispered with reverence, a legend walking among mortals. But legends don't stop crime. They don't fix broken systems. The world he now inhabited was a strange mix of utopian promise and persistent human failing. Technology had leaped forward in ways his friends could have only dreamed of. Gleaming maglev vehicles zipped silently through crystalline cityscapes. Advanced cybernetics could replace lost limbs. Information was an omnipresent, instantaneous stream. Yet villainy remained. It was a weed that grew in the cracks of any society, no matter how perfect. New quirks, more complex and powerful than ever, brought new and more complex challenges. For every problem he solved with his fists, 2 more seemed to sprout from the systemic rot beneath: poverty, quirk discrimination, mental illness, the simple, timeless human craving for power. He had spent a century as the world's ultimate firefighter, rushing from blaze to blaze. But he was tired of dousing flames. He wanted to fireproof the world. This realization came to a head during the Singularity Crisis. A villain named Chimera, whose quirk allowed him to absorb and amalgamate the quirks of others, had gone on a rampage, assimilating a dozen C-list villains into a monstrous, multi-limbed, multi-powered entity. The battle had leveled 3 city blocks of Neo-Kyoto. Izuku, as always, had ended it. He stood in the wreckage, the monstrous form of Chimera unconscious at his feet, surrounded by the flashing lights of the new generation of hero teams. The current number 2 hero, a woman named Lumina with light manipulation powers, approached him, her face a mask of awe. First, she said, her voice filled with reverence. Thank you? We couldn't have. Why did this happen? Izuku interrupted, his voice quiet but carrying an immense, weary weight. He turned his timeless green eyes on her. They weren't the eyes of a 20-year-old. They were the eyes of a 200-year-old being, deep and unsettlingly ancient. Lumina blinked, taken aback. Well, he was a villain. He wanted power. Why did he want power? Izuku pressed, his gaze sweeping over the devastation. I read his file. Kenji Tanaka. His own quirk, Mimic, was deemed weak, useless. He was ostracized as a child, denied entry to every hero academy. Fired from 3 jobs because his quirk made people uncomfortable. He didn't have access to proper quirk counseling or mental health support, so he turned to the black market, to quirk-amplifying drugs, and eventually, to theft and assimilation. We didn't fight a monster today, Lumina. We fought the inevitable result of a dozen systemic failures. The heroes around him were silent, stunned by his words. They saw him as a weapon, a divine intervention. He was telling them he was a janitor, cleaning up messes that should never have been made. "We can't keep doing this," Izuku said, more to himself than to them. "We can't keep punching the symptoms while the disease runs rampant." In that moment, standing in the ruins of another battle he had won, he made a decision. The age of Deku, the frontline brawler, was over. The age of Midoriya, the architect, was about to begin. He vanished from the public eye. The disappearance of the first was a global event. News channels ran endless speculative segments. Conspiracy theories flourished on the hypernet. Was he dead? Had he finally found a way to end his curse? Had he retreated to a hidden monastery in the Himalayas? The truth was far less dramatic and infinitely more ambitious. Izuku moved his base of operations from his sentimental apartment archive to a place that held more meaning than any other, the now decommissioned and preserved grounds of UA High School. The school had been turned into a museum decades ago, a monument to the golden age of heroes, but with a quiet, anonymous donation of an astronomical sum of money and a bit of political leverage that only a being like him could wield, he acquired the entire campus for a new purpose. He began to build. He didn't use construction companies. He used his own two hands, the infinite stamina granted by his curse, and the full, terrifying power of One for All. He worked through the nights, a silent, tireless phantom. He leveled old training grounds and excavated deep into the earth. Black whip tendrils, thick as bridge cables, hauled massive girders into place. Controlled blasts of air pressure carved out new foundations. He was a one-man construction crew, building his new vision from the ground up. The vestiges of One for All were his only companions, his spectral board of directors. "You're attempting to engineer society," 9th, Daigoro Banjo, the 5th, observed one night as Izuku effortlessly welded a titanium beam into place 1,000 feet in the air. "It's a dangerous game. People don't like to be engineered." "I'm not engineering them," Izuku replied aloud, his voice echoing in the skeletal structure of the new central tower. "I'm building them a better workshop. Giving them better tools. The choice of what to build is still theirs." "He has a point," Nana Shimura, the 7th, chimed in, her voice a warm, encouraging presence. "All Might and I fought the villains of our time, but we never had the chance, or the time, to address the reasons they became villains in the first place. You do, Izuku. You have all the time in the world. The key will be subtlety," Yoichi Shigaraki, the 1st, whispered, his voice a thread of caution. "My brother tried to control the world through force. You must guide it through knowledge. There is a fine line between a shepherd and a dictator." "I know," Izuku murmured, pausing to look at his reflection in the polished steel. "I know." Over the course of 5 years of ceaseless, solitary labor, his vision took shape. It rose from the hallowed grounds of UA, a stunning campus of gleaming white towers, serene green spaces, and buildings that integrated cutting-edge technology with minimalist, organic design. He called it the Midoriya Institute for Heroic Advancement. It was not a new hero school. It was something far, far more ambitious. Its charter, which he published globally and anonymously, outlined its 3 core missions. 1. Preventative social programs, to identify and support at-risk youth. This involved funding and establishing community centers, after-school programs, and outreach initiatives in underprivileged districts worldwide. The goal was to provide a support network for children with difficult or minor quirks, offering them purpose and community before resentment and isolation could turn them towards villainy. 2. Quirk counseling and ethical development, to offer free, world-class quirk analysis and counseling to anyone, not just aspiring heroes. The Institute would help individuals understand the full potential of their abilities, not for combat, but for industry, for art, for science. A person whose quirk allowed them to communicate with insects wasn't a potential spy. They were a potential agricultural revolutionary. A boy who could manipulate sound wasn't a future sonic blaster. He was a future acoustical engineer or a groundbreaking musician. It was about reframing quirks not as weapons, but as gifts. 3. Advanced heroic strategy and support. The Institute would serve as a global think tank for pro-heroes. It would not train them in combat, but in de-escalation, disaster relief logistics, collateral damage prevention, and the psychology of villainy. It would be a place where the world's heroes could come to learn, to strategize, and to access the single greatest repository of heroic data in existence, Izuku's own mind and the archive. He revealed himself as the Institute's founder and director in a global broadcast. The sight of him, still 20 years old, standing before the magnificent campus he had seemingly conjured from nothing, sent shockwaves across the planet. He was no longer just the first, the immortal fighter. He was the architect, a figure of unimaginable vision and resources. He didn't ask for power. He offered it. The Institute was a non-profit foundation. Its resources, its knowledge, its programs, they were a gift to the world. A gift from a man who had nothing left to give but his time. The first few years were a struggle. The world was suspicious. Governments saw the Institute as a potential shadow power. Hero agencies viewed it as a threat to their authority. The public saw him as a benevolent but terrifyingly powerful enigma. Izuku didn't fight them. He simply worked. He personally oversaw the development of a new curriculum on hostage negotiation, using the memories of a dozen encounters to craft scenarios of uncanny realism. He worked with bioengineers to develop support gear for individuals whose quirks were physically taxing or dangerous to their own bodies. He spent weeks in deep meditation with the vestiges, collating a century of combat data into predictive algorithms that could forecast criminal activity with stunning accuracy. He was a ghost in his own machine. He rarely appeared in public, preferring to work through his carefully selected department heads. He became a name, a guiding philosophy, an unseen hand on the tiller. The face of the Institute was not his own, but the faces of the thousands of people it helped. The tide began to turn with the Ida Initiative. He had been watching the Ida family for generations. The name Ingenium had been passed down, a noble lineage of heroes dedicated to rescue and rapid response. The current Ingenium, a young woman named Kensei Ida, was the great-great-grandniece of his old friend Tenya. She was brilliant, dedicated, but her agency was struggling, bogged down by bureaucratic red tape and outdated emergency response protocols. He invited her to the Institute. Kensei arrived, wary and proud, expecting a lecture from a living fossil. Instead, she found herself in a vast, silent strategy room. In the center of the room, a holographic map of Japan pulsed with real-time data, traffic flow, weather patterns, seismic activity, emergency service locations. Izuku stood waiting for her, dressed not in a hero costume, but in a simple gray tunic and black pants. He looked younger than her own sidekicks. Ingenium, he greeted her, his voice soft. "Thank you for coming." "First," she replied, her tone formal, guarded. "You requested my presence." "I did," Izuku said. He gestured to the map. "Your family has always been a symbol of speed, of rescue. Your ancestor, Tenya Ida, believed that being the first on the scene was a hero's most sacred duty." He tapped a control panel. The map zoomed in on a simulation, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake striking the southern coast. Red lights flared across the hologram, representing collapsed buildings, fires, and trapped civilians. The projected response time for her agency to reach the hardest-hit areas was 23 minutes. 23 minutes, Izuku said quietly. In a disaster of this scale, that's a lifetime. Thousands of lives lost. Kensei bristled. "My teams are the fastest in the country. Our protocols are outdated," Izuku finished for her, his tone not accusatory, but factual. "They were designed for a different era. Your great-great-granduncle designed them based on the resources he had. We have better resources now." For the next 8 hours he walked her through a new vision. He showed her predictive models that could anticipate infrastructure weak points. He revealed schematics for new, ultra-high-speed drone fleets for delivering medical supplies. He outlined a decentralized command structure that could adapt in real time, rerouting heroes and emergency services based on a live-feed AI he had designed with the help of the vestiges. He had taken the noble, heroic ideal of the Ida family and scaled it up with a century of strategic thought and impossible technology. By the end of it, Kensei Ida was pale, her professional pride shattered and rebuilt into something new. "Ah, this is..." she stammered, looking at the seamless, elegant, life-saving system he had laid out. "This is revolutionary. This could save millions." "It's a start," Izuku said. "The Ida Initiative. A new global standard for emergency response. Funded by my institute. Headed by you. All I ask is that you share the data, so we can continue to refine it." She stared at him, at this ageless boy god who had just handed her the keys to her family's ultimate legacy. Why? Why do all this? Izuku's gaze grew distant, looking at something far beyond the walls of the strategy room. He thought of the original Tenya Ida, so earnest and dedicated, his hand always chopping the air. He thought of his dreams of passing on a legacy. Because a promise was made to me, a long time ago, Izuku said, his voice laced with an ancient sadness. That I should be the hero they couldn't be. I'm just trying to keep that promise. And your family? They were very good at keeping promises. Kensei Ida accepted. The Ida initiative was rolled out over the next decade, and its success was staggering, cutting disaster-related fatalities by over 60% worldwide. It was the proof of concept Izuku needed. The world saw, finally, what he was building. Not an army. Not an empire. He was building a future. He was the architect, and his blueprint was hope. But even in his gleaming tower of logic and progress, the past was never far away. He was still a man, or the echo of one, and his heart was still a lonely, haunted place. 150 years after the curse, he stood alone in the highest room of the Institute's central spire. It was his private sanctuary, a simple, circular room with a panoramic view of the world he had shaped. The room contained only one object, a single, perfectly preserved bonsai tree. It was a gift from Shoto and Momo on his, he couldn't even remember which birthday. His 30th, perhaps? 50th? The years blurred together. He was looking out at the city lights when a young woman entered. She was an intern, a brilliant young historian named Lena, tasked with helping him digitize his personal archives, the photographs, the letters, the mementos of his mortal life. She was bright, fearless, and one of the few people who wasn't overtly terrified of him. Director Midoriya, she said, her voice soft. She held up a small, old, pre-digital data chip. I found this at the bottom of a storage box. It's not labeled. My scanner can't read the format. It's ancient. Izuku turned, his eyes falling on the chip. He recognized it immediately. It was a memory card from a very old camera, one of the first digital models. He took it from her, his fingers tracing its edges. Thank you, Lena, he said. I can handle this one. She nodded and left him in silence. He walked over to a terminal built into the wall. It was one of the few devices in the entire institute he had designed to be backward compatible with archaic technology, a personal concession to his own long history. He slid the chip into a slot. After a moment of whirring and digital translation, a single audio file appeared on the screen. It was titled, interview_uraraka.wave. His breath hitched. He hadn't seen the file in a century? More? It was from a fluff piece a magazine had done on the women of heroism about 25 years after the curse. He hadn't been able to bring himself to listen to it after she was gone. With a trembling finger, he pressed play. The voice that filled the silent room was young, bright, and full of bubbly, optimistic energy. It was the voice of Achiko Uraraka, age 45, a celebrated hero at the height of her career. And I guess, her voice said, warm and familiar, a sound that cut through 150 years of loneliness like a knife. If I had one message for the kids out there who want to be heroes, it's that it's not about how hard you can punch. It really isn't. It's about how much you're willing to help. It's about seeing someone who's having a bad day and just wanting to lift them up a little. That's what my quirk is, right? Making things lighter. And I think that's what being a hero is, too. There was a pause, the faint rustle of paper. People always asked me about Deku, she continued, her tone shifting, becoming softer, more introspective. They see the power, the immortality. They see a god. But I still just see my friend, the nervous, mumbling boy who was willing to shatter his own bones to save someone he didn't even know. He carries such a heavy weight. More than anyone will ever know. I just hope. Her voice caught for a moment, a wave of pure, heartfelt emotion. I just hope he remembers to let other people help carry it sometimes. I hope he knows he's not alone. The recording ended. Silence descended upon the room again, vast and absolute. Izuku stood frozen, his hands still on the console. The voice of his long-dead friend, so full of life and compassion, echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart. I hope he knows he's not alone. A single tear, the first he had shed in decades, traced a path down his unaging cheek. He was the architect of the future. He was revered by billions. He commanded resources that could topple nations. He had built a better world. But in that moment, he had never felt more alone. The architect was an institution, a symbol, a force of nature. But Izuku Midoriya, the man, was a ghost, haunted by the voices of a world that had long since left him behind. He sank to his knees in the silent, empty room, and for the first time in over a century, he wept, not for their loss, but for his own unending, inescapable survival. 300 years. The number itself felt like a fiction. 3 centuries. A span of time so vast it rendered individual human lives into mere footnotes. Nations had risen and fallen like tides. The very geography of the planet had been altered by climate change and terraforming projects. Humanity had touched the face of Mars. The world Izuku had been born into was now a subject of mytho-history, a bygone era of legends and grainy 2D videos. And Izuku Midoriya endured. His institute was a staggering success. The world was, by any objective measure, a near utopia. Global poverty had been virtually eliminated. Violent crime was at an all-time low. Quirk-based discrimination was a social taboo, a relic of a more ignorant age. The IDA initiative had saved countless millions from natural disasters. The Yaoyorozu grant funded innovations that had cured dozens of diseases. The Bakugo scholarship for difficult quirks had turned potential outcasts into pioneers. He had woven the legacies of his friends into the very fabric of this new, brighter world. He was no longer a public figure. He was a whisper. A ghost in his own machine. Director Midoriya was a title, a name on the Institute's letterhead, but the man himself was a recluse. The day-to-day operations were handled by a council of brilliant, mortal minds. He would appear once a decade, perhaps, to give a quiet address or consult on a crisis, his youthful face a jarring, awe-inspiring sight for a new generation. But his work was never done. His life was a quiet, monastic rhythm of vigilance and memory. He would spend weeks in the archive, now a sprawling data nexus deep beneath the Institute, its servers holding the accumulated knowledge of 3 centuries. He would review global threat assessments, analyze social trends, and run simulations of potential futures, always looking for the cracks in his perfect peace. His only real conversations were with the ghosts in the static. The vestiges of One for All were no longer just advisors. They were his family. His cellmates in the prison of forever. Their consciousnesses, preserved and anchored by the same curse that sustained him, had evolved. They were more than echoes. They were fully sentient, complex personalities cohabiting his mind. All Might, Toshinori Yagi, was his father, his confessor, his closest friend. His spectral form, a constant shimmering golden outline in Izuku's mind's eye, was a source of unwavering warmth and encouragement. "You've done well, my boy," Toshinori's voice would resonate, full of pride, as Izuku reviewed a report on declining youth crime rates. "You've built a world we could only dream of." Daigoro Banjo, the fifth, was the pragmatist, the cynical older brother. "Don't get complacent, ninth. Utopia is a garden. It needs constant weeding. Look at this, a new anarchist collective forming in the Eurobloc. Their philosophy is derivative, but their core tech is concerning." Nana Shimura was the heart of their strange family, her presence a comforting, motherly warmth. "Are you sleeping, Izuku? You've been running simulations for 72 hours straight. Even you need to rest your mind." And Yoichi Shigaraki, the first, was the quiet, watchful scholar. His experiences with his brother, the original All-for-One, had made him the ultimate authority on the seductive nature of power. The Council's proposal to implement global predictive justice AI is troubling. The line between protecting people and controlling them is thinner than they realize. You must guide them carefully here, ninth. They were his companions in the loneliest exile imaginable. They kept him sane. They kept him sharp. They kept him human. But sometimes, the silence of his own empty life became too loud for even their voices to fill. And in those times he would walk. He had 1,000 faces, 1,000 names. A simple cloaking device, a marvel of light-refracting technology, allowed him to move through the world anonymously. It didn't make him invisible, but it projected a subtle, generic aura, making his face utterly forgettable, one of the countless billions. He became Haruto, the quiet tourist, Kenji, the traveling student, Akio, the history enthusiast. Today, he was Akio. He wore simple, functional clothes of the era, a self-adjusting synthetic fiber tunic and loose-fitting trousers. He walked the streets of Old Musudafu, a district preserved for its historical significance. The buildings were ancient, squat brick-and-mortar structures from the 21st century, dwarfed by the crystalline towers that pierced the clouds miles away. It was a pilgrimage he made every few decades. He stood before a particular building, a place the tourists and history buffs rarely noticed. It was a crumbling, two-story apartment complex, its windows boarded up, its facade stained by 3 centuries of acid rain. A faded sign above the door, barely legible, read, Musudafu Municipal Apartments 3. It was where his mother had lived, where he had grown up. He closed his eyes, and the ghosts of memory were more vivid than the world around him. He could smell his mother's katsudon. He could feel the worn fabric of his old All Might onesie. He could hear her voice, so full of love and worry, telling him he could be a hero. Inko, he thought, the name a painful, precious stone in his mind. He had outlived her by 250 years. He had watched her grow old, had held her hand as she passed, her last words a whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Miyazuku." She was a wonderful woman, Nana Shimura's voice echoed gently in his mind. She had your heart. He nodded, a barely perceptible motion, and continued his walk. His next stop was a place of reverence, a place that drew crowds from across the globe. Yue High School. The original school building, the one he had attended, was the centerpiece of the museum campus that surrounded his institute. It was perfectly preserved, a time capsule from the Age of Origins. He paid the entry fee like any other tourist and joined a tour group being led by a cheerful android guide. And on your left, you'll see a recreation of the original Class 1A classroom, the android chirped, its voice synthesized to be pleasant and engaging. This room was home to some of the greatest heroes of the era, including the legendary Ingenium, the elemental powerhouse Shoto, and the explosive Dynamite. Izuku stood at the back of the group, looking into the classroom. The desks were arranged just as he remembered. He could almost see them all there, Ida, sitting ramrod straight in the front row, Bakugo, slouched with his feet up, glaring, Uraraka, turning to smile at him. The ghosts were so thick here, he could barely breathe. Things were simpler then, Daigoro's voice rumbled. The mission was clear: become a hero, beat the bad guys. It was never simple, Toshinori corrected gently. But it was hopeful. We didn't know the cost of things yet. The tour moved on, but Izuku lingered. He walked over to a display case. Inside, cushioned on a bed of black velvet, was a collection of artifacts. A pair of shattered gauntlets, shaped like grenades. A dented, half-melted helmet, half red and half white. And in the center, a single, tattered green shoe with a red sole, its laces frayed. The display plaque read, "Iconic equipment of the first 3. He stared at his own shoe, a piece of his childhood, now a holy relic behind glass. He was a museum piece, even to himself. His final stop on this pilgrimage was the hardest. He took a maglev train to the coast, to a stretch of public parkland that had once been a garbage-filled disgrace. Dagoba Beach. It was beautiful now. Clean white sand stretched to meet a sparkling, pollution-free ocean. Families were playing, children laughing. A monument stood near the entrance to the beach, a towering bronze statue. It depicted 2 figures. One was All Might, in his magnificent, smiling prime. The other was a small, skinny, quirkless boy, his face a mask of tearful, determined agony, hauling a refrigerator on his back. The plaque read, "Where the symbol of peace found his successor. You can become a hero." Izuku stood before the monument, a forgettable face in the crowd, and felt the full, crushing weight of his journey. From that desperate, crying boy to the immortal architect of a utopian world, All Might had given him a dream, and Kronos had turned it into an eternal sentence. He would be so proud, Toshinori, Nana whispered in his mind. Not just of the hero you became, but of the boy you were. You never lost that heart. Izuku didn't answer. He just watched the families on the beach, a new generation enjoying the peace he had built for them. He tried to form connections, he truly did. He would occasionally strike up a conversation with a stranger, share a meal, offer a kindness. But he could never let them get close. It was a kindness to them, and a self-preservation for himself. Every new bond was a future grief. Every new friend was a future funeral. His heart was a fortress, its walls built of loss, and the gates had been sealed for a very long time. He had disciplined himself into a state of detached, benevolent kindness. He loved humanity, in the grand, abstract sense. He would die for any one of them, 1,000 times over. But loving an individual person? That was a luxury he had forfeited 3 centuries ago. He turned away from the statue and began the long walk back towards the station, his pilgrimage of ghosts complete for another year. He coped with routine. With discipline. Mornings were for physical maintenance. Not that his body needed it, it would reset to its peak condition regardless, but the act of training grounded him. He would spend hours in a zero-gravity combat simulator, honing his skills, his movements a blur of green lightning and black tendrils. It was a dance of lethal precision, a conversation with his own power. Afternoons were for the archive. For guiding the world from the shadows, for being the unseen shepherd. Evenings, however, were for memory. In his private quarters, he had constructed a special room. It wasn't a sad, maudlin memorial. It was a workshop. Here, he practiced the hobbies and crafts of his long-dead friends. On one workbench, meticulously ordered tools for precision engineering lay beside half-finished support gear, a tribute to Momo's genius. He would spend weeks trying to replicate her designs, marveling at the effortless brilliance he saw in her old blueprints. In another corner stood a loom, where he painstakingly wove complex, beautiful tapestries, the threads moving through his fingers with a grace that mimicked Mina Ashido's dancing. He tried to capture her vibrant, joyful spirit in the colors. There was a small, soundproofed recording studio where he practiced music, learning to play the guitar with Kyokujiro's patient, spectral guidance. No, ninth, your fingering on the G chord is sloppy. Again. He learned to cook every one of Rikido Sato's signature cake recipes. He practiced Kirishima's manly calligraphy. He studied ornithology, a passion of Koji Koda's. Each skill learned was a prayer. Each act of creation was an act of remembrance. It was how he kept them alive, not as names in a history book, but as active, vibrant presences in his own life. It was how he honored the piece of them that lived on inside him. Tonight's project was different. It was more personal. He was in a small, quiet room, hunched over a desk. Under the bright, clear light of a work lamp, he was meticulously drawing. He was not a natural artist like some of his friends had been, but 300 years of practice had given him a steady hand and an unerring eye for detail. He was working on a comic book. It was the story of a hero. A loud, explosive, angry hero with a powerful quirk and an even more powerful spirit. The hero's name was Ground Zero. Izuku drew him with fierce, determined eyes and a triumphant, arrogant grin, launching himself into battle against impossible odds. It was a story for children, full of action and bright colors, but it was imbued with a deeper message, that a hero's greatest strength is their capacity for change, for growth. You've finally captured his smirk, came Bakugo's voice, a gruff, spectral rumble in his mind. It was a voice he hadn't heard in decades. The curse that preserved the vestiges was strange. Their presence would wax and wane. Bakugo's, like his living self, was often distant, prideful, and quiet. Izuku's hand stilled. A small, sad smile touched his lips. I've had a lot of practice. Humph. It's not bad, for a damn nerd, Bakugo's echo grumbled. Making me into a cartoon character. At least make me look cool. I'm trying, Kaken, Izuku whispered to the empty room. He drew for hours, losing himself in the clean lines and bright ink, a conversation with a ghost only he could hear. It was his most cherished ritual. He would publish these comics under a pseudonym, adding them to the global entertainment networks for free. He never made any money from them. That wasn't the point. The point was ensuring that the spirit of his friend, the true spirit of Katsuki Bakugo, would never be forgotten. That children would be inspired not just by his power, but by his heart. He was just finishing a panel, a dramatic splash page of Ground Zero saving a crowd of civilians, when a new presence flickered in his consciousness. It was a faint, worried pulse from Nana Shimura. Izuku. You need to see this. He put down his pen, the comforting world of his memories dissolving. He turned to the main terminal on his wall, his expression shifting from wistful remembrance to focused seriousness. What is it, Nana? A live news feed from the Euroblock appeared on the screen. The anchor, a woman with chromed eyes and bioluminescent hair, was speaking in grave tones. The broadcast has hijacked all public networks in the sector. We repeat, this is not a drill. The group calling themselves the Ephemerals has begun their address. The screen flickered, replaced by a stark, minimalist image, a simple, stylized icon of an hourglass, its sand running out. A voice spoke, calm, charismatic, and utterly convinced of its own righteousness. Greetings, citizens of the world. We are the Ephemerals. We are not villains. We are not terrorists. We are philosophers. We are artists. We are historians, and we have come to ask a single, terrifying question. Has humanity forgotten how to live? The camera pulled back to reveal the speaker. It was not a hulking brute or a cackling madman. It was a woman, perhaps in her late 30s, with intelligent eyes and a calm, professorial demeanor. She stood on a simple stage, addressing a massive, captivated crowd. For 3 centuries, the woman continued, her voice resonating with passion, we have lived in the benevolent, eternal shadow of one man. The first. Director Midoriya. He has given us peace. He has given us safety. He has given us a world without strife, without want, without fear. He has given us a beautiful, gilded cage. Izuku stared at the screen, his blood running cold. This was new. This wasn't a cry for power or money. This was an ideological attack, aimed at the very foundation of his life's work. But what have we lost in exchange for this perfect peace? The woman asked, her voice rising. Where is our art? Our struggle? Our progress? True growth, true beauty, true humanity is not born from comfort. It is forged in the crucible of loss. It is carved by the harsh reality of our own mortality. Our lives have meaning because they end. Our choices have weight because they are finite. The crowd roared its approval. This man, this eternal symbol, is a living paradox, the woman declared, her gaze seeming to pierce through the screen, to find him in his lonely room. In his quest to save everyone, he has robbed us of the one thing that makes life worth living, the struggle. His unending presence has made us stagnant, complacent. We are children who have never been allowed to leave the nursery. The unsetting sun has cast a light so bright, it has bleached the color from our souls. Ninth, this is dangerous, Joichi's voice whispered, sharp with alarm. She's not using a quirk. She's using an idea. We do not wish to harm Director Midoriya, the woman said, her voice softening, becoming almost sympathetic. We revere him as a historical figure. But his time is over. The age of the Eternal Guardian must end, so that the age of humanity can truly begin. We do not want to kill him. We simply want him to disappear. To let us go. To let us stand or fall on our own 2 feet. To give us back our mortality. To give us back our souls. The broadcast ended, the hourglass icon returning for a moment before the feed cut back to the stunned news anchor. Izuku stood motionless, the ghost in his mind silent for once. He stared at his own reflection in the blank screen. He saw the face of a 20-year-old boy. He saw the eyes of a 300-year-old man, and for the first time, he saw the flaw in his grand design. He had spent centuries trying to protect humanity from its villains, its disasters, its own self-destructive tendencies. He had built a utopia of peace and safety. He had honored his friends' legacies. He had done everything he thought was right, but the woman was right. He had been so focused on saving them from death, he had never considered that he might be saving them from life itself. The silence in the room was absolute. Then, from the deepest part of his consciousness, a familiar, treasured voice broke through the static, a voice he hadn't heard in so long. It was faint, tired, but unmistakably clear. It was the voice of Ochiko Uraraka. Deku-kun, is she right? He had no answer. He looked at his drawing of Ground Zero, the symbol of heroic struggle, and then at his own unaging face in the screen. A new, terrifying thought began to form, a question that cut deeper than any loss, any loneliness he had ever endured. Was he the world's greatest hero, or its most benevolent, final villain?